Welcome to this module that will cover techniques on establishing the parameters that you will fly with the aircraft using the mode control panel. What I want to cover is some techniques and disciplines on the use of the mode control panel. The purpose behind this is to demonstrate some ways to operate the various functions of the mode control panel and some of its idiosyncrasies in those operations. What is also important in describing these techniques is the verification steps after executing these functions of operation. Establishing good habit patterns on the use of the mode control panel and the verification process is most important in eliminating many of the common problems that occur in its use. Your airline will have, or for those of you who already are employed by an airline, have operating philosophies and procedures for the use of the mode control panel and the FMC. There may be different terms that each airline uses, but the process will entail some kind of verbalization and verification and monitoring that is required by the crew. I want to reemphasize that. Some verbalization is probably part of the protocol. Verification should always be part of the protocol, and monitoring continually should be part of the process of the professional pilot operating the auto flight director system. Generally, mistakes in operational functions of the mode control panel have to do with breakdown in the verification and monitoring process. The best procedures to ensure compliance and discipline in this process is to establish a protocol that forces both pilots to communicate and verify what their actions are. Where communication and verification of actions by the pilots is a standard practice. I want to emphasize that, a standard practice. That means there's very specific protocols that are written that are expected to be complied with by whoever you fly with. It's not going to be some individual processes. This is what I'm talking about when I say standard practices. But it's less likely to result in some of the common errors that occur with the monitoring process when those type of protocols are in place. And I will tell you that's not necessarily the case with some airlines and some cultures. What I want to cover in this module is some operational techniques that are associated with the mode control panel that will help this verbalization, verification, and especially monitoring process. And techniques are always involved in our profession. Techniques are something that you can embrace or you can ignore. Be aware of that. But where your airline has specific protocols, that is something that you're expected to adhere to and will help in the standardization process in operating this system. But techniques help us prevent some of the occurrences that happen where there are mistakes that are made and are not caught in the monitoring process. Now, one of the most important that I want to cover with you is making some changes in the mode control panel when it comes to speed, headings, and altitude. So we're going to talk about a technique here that if you establish this early in your training and in your mindset, it will prevent some of the common errors that occur in the operation of the mode control panel when our focus is changing numbers in the windows of the mode control panel rather than on the flight instruments. So I want to go over some of these. You'll notice in this first slide here, we're going to talk about speed, setting speed. Now I want you to notice what I did is block the window where, in this case here, the number is 250 knots that is set, and that's blocked out in here. I don't want you to see that. What I want to teach you to do is when you have a speed change and you're operating in the lower level of the mode control panel, that what I want you to do is first reach to the appropriate knob. In this case here, we want to reach to the speed knob here and make sure that it's a speed knob that you have. And then instead of changing it in the window, sorry, I'm having a problem here with my cursor. Instead of changing it in the window, look down on the primary flight display and change the speed here above the tape or here on the indice, not in the window. Now here what we're going to do is change heading. Notice I have heading window blocked out, but we have been given a new heading to turn to, and with that, what we want to do is to make sure that we have the heading knob, and again, notice there's a difference in the feel of it, but that isn't what generally happens when we're operating. But take a second or two to make sure you're on the proper knob. And then instead of changing the heading in the window, change the heading. If it's within 45 degrees, go to your nav display and take your indice and change to the new heading here on the compass rose on the outside of the nav display. Or if it's more than that, or at any time, you can always go down here, and this is where you want to set the heading. So again, what we're trying to do is establish a pattern and a habit that we get the correct knob to make the change, and instead of doing it in the window, what we're looking to do is do it on the compass itself. Now when it comes to changing altitude, same technique. Make sure you get the correct knob that is below the altitude window. Don't look here to change the altitude, but change it here. So this precludes some mistakes of making changes in the wrong, because I'm on the wrong knob and I'm looking at the window. With this technique, if you happen to take the wrong knob, for instance, if I'm intending to change speed and I inadvertently select the heading window and I make a change looking at the number in the heading window, I don't notice that change until after it's set, and by then I may have lost 20, 30 knots. And if this is happening on an approach, that can be a situation that you definitely don't want to happen. So this technique will prevent you from having some of those kind of mistakes that happen. And I can promise you, and I can tell you, it's happened to me many times. It's happened to almost everybody. I think anybody who's been flying this airplane and they're in the habit of making changes in the windows of the mode control panel rather than on the flight instruments themselves, they've had this kind of error occur, and not just once. But keep in mind, I'm going to talk about human factors here all throughout our processes, gang. And human factors of fatigue, human factors of routine definitely play into this kind of mistake. Get in the habit of making these changes on the flight instruments, and in case of heading, on the map. If it's within that 45 degrees, that's the best place to see it. Or go down to the compass on the primary flight display. All right, I hope I have this pointer cursor condition corrected here. But now what we're going to do is talk about an idiosyncrasy that's associated with changing altitude in the mode control panel. Now here we are in a situation of where we are maintaining 5,000 feet. But we have been given a clearance to climb to 7,000 feet. Now, that's our clearance, okay? And what I've done is preset this up to the 7,000 feet. And we're going to make that change with level change. But I want you to notice, as soon as I go to 5,100 feet or beyond, I just rotate that knob here to change the altitude. This stays in altitude hold. What you get is a white vert speed that is armed, which will allow me an option to climb in vert speed. But in this case, what we're going to do is climb with level change. Now, once I make that change, I have to go into level change to make the aircraft climb. This is where verbalization is important, because just setting an altitude on this mode control panel isn't going to make the airplane climb. And if I don't know the system well enough, and this happens to be an area that takes a while for new people to kind of get in the habit of, I have to make a change to execute the climb. It isn't going to climb just because I set it in the window. So in this case here, what we're going to do, engage level change. Now notice, once I engage level change, I get a green light indicating that it is engaged, but that's not sufficient. What I need to do is to verify that the aircraft has received the command to the flight director or the autopilot, and I go to my flight mode annunciator. I see in my flight mode annunciator, I now have the power coming up to a climb power, which is over here in my FMC on the climb page. And that climb setting is 90.3. And notice I go to my thrust mode annunciator and I see that this is continuing to move up to that setting. It's moving through 81.1 up to that setting. So what I'm doing is seeing that I'm in the climb mode. The pitch window has now converted to flying the speed of 250 knots based on the pitch of the aircraft. And another indication that I really want to get in the habit of you to get in the habit of, whenever I'm changing an altitude, whether it is a climb or a descent, I get this altitude arc. That is going to be very important later for approaches and compliance with altitude restrictions. Always get in the habit of looking on a nav display and seeing that this altitude arc is displayed, and that is going to tell me where the aircraft is going to be when I level at the altitude that I have engaged. Now in this case here, it's out a little bit further because we don't have much of a climb yet. But once you get established in the climb, that altitude arc is going to move a lot closer to the aircraft. Now in this case, what we're going to do is talk about climbing in vert speed. Now here's a situation that using vert speed in this aircraft, if you're only climbing a few thousand feet, descending a few thousand feet, and you don't want the power to come all the way up, this is a good mode for operating. But here we go back to not the previous slide, but the one before that. We had vert speed armed. So what we did in this situation, because we wanted to climb in vert speed, we engaged vert speed. We depressed the vert speed button. It illuminated. Then we'll set a climb rate that we want in the vert speed window. And we use this knob to do it. And then we check our flight mode annunciator on the primary flight display, and we see that the speed, the auto throttle is operating based on the mode control panel speed, which we have here in this window. We're on a heading, and we are climbing in vert speed at 1,000 feet per minute. And notice this little indice here. Notice also, here's our arc. At this rate of climb, this is where we're going to level off at 7,000 feet as we go through this 5,100 feet. Notice that the power does not come up to full power. It gives you enough power to climb at that speed. I want to cover quickly here, going to the upper level of the mode control panel display, where we're giving over these indications of speed and lateral condition to the FMC. Here's the route for lateral. Here is the vertical profile. Now, with these profiles, when I'm in VNAV, that means the vertical profile of the aircraft is controlled by FMC in the climb, the cruise, or the descent mode. In this case here, with the window closed, notice that the speed window is closed, but we have over here 250 knots, which is the same speed that is set in the FMC. And I should be looking at and coordinating that, cross-checking the speed here and that it is adhering to the FMC. So the speed window is closed. I've given over speed control to the computer or the aircraft. My lateral mode also is given over to the computer of the aircraft, this being the legs that are the route of flight that is set up here in this magenta line. But we're going to talk about speed here now. So in this case, when we're in this VNAV mode, this window will be closed, trying to tell you that, hey, this is where you're going to see where your speeds are that we're going to operate at over here in the FMC. I can tell you that this is an area here where a lot of people, especially when you're learning, even experienced pilots, don't use this cross-check enough to understand what the aircraft's doing speed-wise. Here what we're going to do is talk about the altitude mode in VNAV, because VNAV controls the vertical profile as well as the speed profile that's in the computer. When I'm operating the mode control panel though, and in this case here, we're level at 6,000 feet. We have been given a clearance to climb to 9,000 feet. Again, notice, the aircraft is not climbing. The indications that I have, I can tell here that my speed is controlled by what is set in the FMC. My lateral route is being flown by the FMC, and I do have VNAV altitude engaged, indicating that I am in the VNAV mode. That's what it's telling me, but it's not climbing. Again, setting the altitude is not going to do it. I have got to execute an action to make it climb. And again, this is an area that is a uniqueness to this aircraft in the vertical profile and very often is missed, expecting that when I set in the window that altitude is going to climb. No, it won't. I must do something just like I had to do with level change or with vert speed. And in the case of the VNAV mode, this altitude intervention will help you execute the climb. So once I set an altitude and I want to make this aircraft climb, I depress the altitude intervention button. Now the 9,000 feet that I have set, once I execute that climb power applied to the aircraft, which is this speed over here in the climb page, maintaining 250 knots. I got a climb that started. I'm still navigating the magenta line for the course, but now I have VNAV speed instead of VNAV altitude. This is telling me that what I'm doing is maintaining the computer speed of 250 knots. Notice window's closed, but I'm doing it in pitch. Pitch is controlling the speed of the aircraft. And again, I want to notice where I'm going to be level at 9,000 feet, and I can see on my thrust mode annunciator that the power has come up to a climb power setting. So altitude intervention is a way to get the aircraft to climb. Now another way to do it too, and I'm not going to advocate this or display this in this presentation, but what I could do to start a climb, if I had VNAV engaged and I had VNAV alt here like in that previous slide, I can go ahead and disengage VNAV, extinguish the light, and a second later just depress VNAV again. It will re-engage, see that you've got the light, look down here, see that it went to VNAV speed, and it's climbing. That's a secondary way to make the aircraft climb in VNAV. Now what we're going to cover in this slide is the use of speed intervention in the VNAV mode. You will use this a lot. And I'm going to be a big advocate for you, gang, that you never come out of VNAV unless absolutely necessary. Because the operation of this speed intervention button, staying in VNAV, or in and out of closing the window and opening the window to control speed, is just an important process for managing the climb and descent profiles temporarily. But we'll get into a lot more on that, especially in the descent profiles. But here's what I want to teach you with this. Notice in the previous slide, we were in VNAV and the speed window was closed. But now what we've been doing, we've been given an instruction to slow to 230 knots. So what we're going to have to do is open that window, and I can open that window in the VNAV mode by depressing this speed intervention button. And once I do that, I now can set the speed down here. I can set the speed by operating the speed knob. So what we did is grab the speed knob. We know that the window's open, and we're going to go down here to set the speed at 230 knots. So I rotate it counterclockwise, set 230 knots, and notice what happens. I stay in VNAV, and I start to reduce speed to 230 knots. Now, also I want you to notice that in the FMC, the computerized speed is 250 knots. It doesn't show the 230 here. I have seen some systems that will show you that. So this may be a situation that you might see some anomalies, but I want you to note that the 230 knots, we're in the speed mode, it is mechanically adjusted over what is in the computer. Now what we're going to illustrate here is returning to VNAV speed and closing that window. And for instance, there's a situation where maybe ATC temporarily asks you to maintain 230 knots until advised. And so what we did is stay in VNAV. No need to come out of VNAV to do this. Stay in VNAV, speed intervention, take the speed, reduce it to 230 knots. And now what we're going to do is go back normal speed. So again, because we're below 10,000 feet, that's going to be what's in the FMC at 250 knots. So all I simply have to do is go up here to the speed intervention button and depress it. And then notice what's happened is that once I depressed it, again, staying in the VNAV mode, but it closes the window and sends information back through the computers. We want 250 knots. That's what the FMC vertical or speed profile is requiring. And I certainly see that what's happened here is the speed bug has moved to 250 knots on the indice and above the tape. And I see that I have gone back to FMC speed mode. And here notice that we're back up at 250 knots, and again having all that confirmed in our FMA. Now the other thing I want you to notice, gang, I want you to really get in a habit. When you scan these instruments, it's amazing the information and the good habit pattern of monitoring that you're going to discover. Notice in the previous slide we had a heading mode up here. It was flying LNAV, but I was making sure the heading was up on the indice in the carry. We haven't even turned to that heading yet, but I can look on my nav display, and what I can do is go to my heading knob, and even prior to being on that course, I can go ahead and set it roughly up into this area and then fine tune it when I'm on there. But I'm going to the heading knob, I'm looking down here, and I set my course indice. Gang, always be monitoring the aircraft in every profile, and in doing so, when you see something that needs to be done to marry up the aircraft with its different tools, do it. Don't be sloppy. Be professional. All right, this is it for this presentation. I hope this was significant to you because, gang, if you use this technique of looking at the primary flight display and the nav display to set things like speed, altitude, and heading on the nav display, it'll keep you out of a lot of errors that can happen. I can promise you that. So The other thing I would say, if you're new to the aircraft and you're going through training, ask your instructor. And I know some airlines do this, and I think it's one of the great techniques of helping people learn to operate speed, heading, and altitude modes. See if they will allow you to put tape over those windows during training. And that will force you to understand this mode control panel system in having you operate the knobs and make those changes on the appropriate instruments. And it will help you develop a habit pattern of not only setting things correctly, but monitoring it and seeing that it is complied with what you attempted to do. So again, hopefully this was helpful to you. I think this is one of the most important aspects of learning how to operate the mode control panel for the speed, headings, and altitude mode.